I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Brenda Morrison standing on my front porch at 7 in the morning, clutching her iPad like it was evidence in a murder trial. My golden retriever, Max, had been with me for 3 years, ever since I moved into this cookie-cutter subdivision in Scottsdale, Arizona called Desert Heights. He was the most laid-back dog you could imagine, spending most of his days lounging in the shade of my backyard mesquite tree and occasionally barking when the mailman showed up. But Brenda, the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association, had apparently decided that Max was public enemy number 1. "Ryan Foster, we need to talk," she said, her voice dripping with that particular brand of righteous indignation that only a middle-aged HOA president could muster. Her blonde highlights were perfectly arranged despite the early hour, and her tennis outfit looked like it cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. I was still in my pajama pants and an old university t-shirt, coffee mug in hand, completely unprepared for whatever crusade Brenda had launched this time. "Good morning to you too, Brenda. What's this about?" She thrust the iPad toward me, and I could see what looked like a spreadsheet with times and dates. "Your dog has been barking excessively for weeks now. I've been documenting every incident. This is a clear violation of Section 4.7 of our HOA covenant, which states that no homeowner shall keep any animal that creates a nuisance or disturbance to neighbors." I stared at the screen, genuinely confused. Max was inside the house right now, probably still asleep on his dog bed in the living room. "Brenda, Max barely barks. Are you sure you're not hearing someone else's dog?" Her eyes narrowed, and I could see the red creeping up her neck. "I know what I hear, Ryan. Every single morning at 6:30, your dog starts barking and doesn't stop for at least 20 minutes. Then again in the evening around 5. It's disturbing my meditation practice and my husband's work calls. He works from home, you know." I did know. Everyone in the neighborhood knew, because Brenda mentioned it approximately once per conversation, as if her husband, being a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, was equivalent to being a Supreme Court justice. "Look, I'm usually up by 6:15, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that Max doesn't bark for 20 minutes straight, ever. He might bark once or twice when he hears something outside, but that's about it." Brenda's lips pressed into a thin line. "Are you calling me a liar?" "I'm saying there might be a misunderstanding. Maybe it's the Henderson's Beagle 2 streets over or the Clark's German Shepherd. Sound carries weird in the morning here." She pulled the iPad back against her chest. "I know where the sound is coming from, Ryan. I've lived here for 12 years. I know every inch of this neighborhood, and I'm formally notifying you that if this continues, I'll be filing a formal complaint with animal control. You have 1 week to resolve this issue." Before I could respond, she turned on her pristine white sneakers and marched back down my walkway, leaving me standing there with cold coffee and a sinking feeling in my stomach. I went back inside and looked at Max, who had indeed wandered out to the kitchen and was now sitting by his food bowl, tail wagging slowly, looking at me with those big brown eyes that always made me feel like I was the center of his universe. "Did you wake up the neighborhood this morning, buddy?" I asked, scratching behind his ears. He just leaned into my hand, making a contented groaning sound that was about as aggressive as Max ever got. The thing about HOAs is that they operate in this weird gray area between being your neighbors and being a pseudo-governmental authority. Our Desert Heights HOA had reasonable rules, mostly about keeping your lawn maintained and not painting your house neon purple. But Brenda had been president for the past 4 years, and in that time, she had transformed from an occasionally nosy neighbor into a full-blown enforcement machine. She had fined the Rodriguez family for having their trash cans visible from the street on a non-collection day. She had sent certified letters to old Mrs. Chen about her rose bushes extending 3 inches over the property line. She had even tried to ban basketball hoops in driveways, claiming they were aesthetically incompatible with the desert landscape vision. I spent that day at work as a civil engineer for a construction firm downtown, but my mind kept wandering back to Brenda's accusation. During my lunch break, I called my neighbor to the left, Tom Patterson, who I'd helped move furniture a few months back. "Tom, hey, it's Ryan from next door. Quick question. Have you ever heard Max barking excessively, like in the mornings or evenings?" There was a pause. "You're golden." "Dude, I don't think I've ever heard him bark more than once or twice at a time." "Why?" "Brenda Morrison came by this morning claiming he's been barking for 20 minutes straight every day." Tom laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Oh man, she's on one of her campaigns again. Last year she tried to convince everyone that my wind chimes were creating auditory pollution. You know what I think? She's bored. Her kids are off at college, her husband is always traveling or locked in his office, and she's got nothing to do but make everyone else miserable. She's threatening to call animal control. Let her. They'll come out, see that you've got a healthy, well-behaved dog, and that'll be the end of it. Don't let her bully you, man. That's what she wants." I appreciated Tom's support, but I also knew that dealing with animal control, even if I was in the right, would be a hassle I didn't need. I decided to try the diplomatic route first. That evening, I sent Brenda an email through the HOA portal, keeping it polite and professional. I explained that I'd spoken with neighbors who hadn't noticed any excessive barking, offered to install a security camera in my backyard to record Max's behavior during the times she mentioned, and suggested we could review the footage together to identify if there was actually a problem, or if perhaps the sound was coming from elsewhere. Her response came back within an hour. "I don't need video evidence. I have my own documentation. Please address the issue or face formal consequences." Over the next few days, I became hyper-aware of every sound Max made. I started keeping a log of my own, noting every time he barked, what time it was, and what triggered it. In 5 days, he barked a total of 11 times, 6 times at the mailman, 3 times at a stray cat that wandered through the yard, and twice at absolutely nothing I could identify. None of these barking episodes lasted more than maybe 10 seconds. But on day 6, I came home from work to find a notice taped to my front door. It was an official letter from Maricopa County Animal Control, informing me that a complaint had been filed regarding excessive barking from a dog at my address. An officer would be conducting a site visit within the next week to investigate. My hands clenched around the paper. Brenda had actually done it. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how this could escalate. Could they take Max away? Could I get fined? I'd heard horror stories about animal control situations gone wrong, though I also knew that Arizona actually had pretty reasonable laws about dogs and noise complaints. The problem was that HOAs often had their own additional rules that could be even more restrictive than county ordinances. The next morning I was up at 5:30, determined to figure out what was happening. I made coffee, sat on my back patio with Max lying at my feet, and waited. At exactly 6:28 I heard it, barking. Rapid, high-pitched, definitely not Max's deeper woof. And it was coming from the direction of Brenda's house. I stood up slowly, trying to pinpoint the exact source. The sound seemed to be coming from Brenda's backyard, which was diagonal from mine, separated by the Pattersons' property. I walked to the side fence, and the barking got louder. It wasn't just one dog. It sounded like multiple dogs, all yapping in that particular way small dogs do. Max, for his part, was completely disinterested, sniffing around his favorite spot near the air conditioning unit. The barking continued for about 15 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I checked my watch. 6:43. Almost exactly the time frame Brenda had accused Max of barking. I felt a surge of anger mixed with disbelief. Was Brenda's own dog or dogs making the noise she was attributing to Max? Or was she somehow so confused about where the sound was coming from that she genuinely believed it was my dog? I decided I needed evidence. Real, undeniable evidence. I went to the hardware store that afternoon and bought a basic outdoor security camera system with audio recording. I spent Saturday installing cameras covering both my backyard and front yard, making sure they captured clear audio of the surrounding area. The system I bought stored everything on a cloud server, time-stamped and dated. If animal control came by, I'd have proof of exactly what Max was or wasn't doing. On Sunday morning, I watched the footage from the previous day. At 6:30, right on schedule, I could hear the distant yapping starting. Max's ears perked up, he lifted his head, let out one single woof, then put his head back down. The yapping continued for another 14 minutes in the background. At 5:05 in the evening, the same thing happened. Distant barking from multiple dogs, Max barking once, then silence from him while the other dogs continued. I clipped the relevant portions of the video and saved them to my phone. Then I checked the HOA directory for Brenda's email and sent her a message. Hi Brenda, I've installed security cameras as I mentioned. I've reviewed the footage and discovered that Max barks very minimally, usually 1 or 2 barks in response to other dogs in the neighborhood. I have video evidence showing the times you mentioned, which I'm happy to share with you. I believe the excessive barking you're hearing is coming from another source. Perhaps we could meet to discuss this. Her response was icy. I stand by my complaint. The animal control officer will make the determination. Fine. If she wanted to play it that way, I'd let animal control see the evidence themselves. Officer Linda Chavez from Maricopa County Animal Control showed up on Tuesday afternoon. She was a stocky woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lot of time outdoors dealing with animals and frustrated pet owners. Mr. Foster, she asked, clipboard in hand. That's me. Please come in. Max is in the backyard right now. She followed me through the house, taking in the clean floors, the dog bed in the corner, the water and food bowls that were clearly regularly maintained. How long have you had Max? 3 years. He's 5 years old, rescue from a shelter in Phoenix. He's incredibly gentle, good with kids, never been aggressive. And the complaint is about barking. Yes, the HOA president claims he barks excessively every morning and evening for extended periods. But I've been monitoring him closely, and I've installed security cameras with audio. He barely barks at all. Officer Chavez made a note. Can I see the backyard? I slid open the glass door and Max immediately trotted over, tail wagging. Officer Chavez knelt down and let him sniff her hand, then gave him a thorough pet. Hey there, buddy, you causing trouble? Max responded by rolling over for belly rubs. She smiled. He seems very calm. Let me take a look around the property. I watched as she examined the yard, checked the fences, looked at the neighboring properties. I want to be upfront with you, Officer Chavez. I have video evidence from the past several days showing exactly when Max barks and how often. Would you like to see it? Her eyebrows went up. Absolutely. We went back inside, and I pulled up the footage on my laptop. I showed her the morning recordings, pointing out the timestamp when the distant barking started, Max's single responsive bark, and the continuation of the other barking. I showed her the evening recordings with the same pattern. Officer Chavez watched carefully, her expression neutral. "And you know where that other barking is coming from?" "I believe it's coming from the HOA president's property, actually." Brenda Morrison, the woman who filed the complaint. Something flickered in Officer Chavez's eyes, amusement maybe, or recognition. "Brenda Morrison on Saguaro Drive." "You know her. We've received complaints originating from her before. Different addresses, different issues." She didn't elaborate, but her tone said enough. "Look, Mr. Foster, based on what I'm seeing here, your dog is not exhibiting excessive barking behavior. Under Arizona Revised Statute 11-1012, a dog is considered a nuisance if it barks or howls to such an extent that it disturbs the peace of the neighborhood. From this evidence and from my observation, your dog doesn't meet that threshold." Relief flooded through me. "So what happens now?" "I'll file a report stating that I found no evidence of excessive barking. I'll note that you've been proactive in monitoring your pet's behavior and that you have documentation supporting your claim. The complaint will be marked as unsubstantiated. Will Brenda be notified?" "Yes, she'll receive a copy of my report. I should mention, if the barking that's disturbing her is actually coming from dogs on her own property, that's something she needs to address herself. We can't cite you for someone else's pets." After Officer Chavez left, I felt vindicated but also uneasy. I knew this wasn't over. Brenda wasn't the type to accept being wrong, especially not when it was documented in an official report. I was right. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA. It informed me that I was being fined $500 for failure to control pet noise, and that a hearing had been scheduled for the following week to determine if additional penalties, including forced removal of the pet, were warranted. I read the letter 3 times, my blood pressure rising with each pass. Officer Chavez had literally just filed a report saying there was no excessive barking. How could the HOA still fine me? I called Tom Patterson again. "They're fining me $500 and threatening to make me get rid of Max, after animal control found nothing wrong." "Dude, you need to fight this. Don't just pay the fine. That's admitting guilt. You need to go to that hearing and bring all your evidence." Can they even do this? Override an animal control report. HOAs have a lot of power, man. They can enforce their own rules as long as they're not breaking any laws, but they also have to follow their own procedures. Have you read the HOA covenant documents? Like, really read them? I admitted I hadn't, not thoroughly. When I bought the house, my real estate agent had given me a thick stack of papers that I'd skimmed and signed. I'd read the basic rules about lawn maintenance and exterior modifications, but I hadn't studied the enforcement procedures or the appeals process. That night, I dug out the HOA documents from my filing cabinet and started reading. The covenant was 63 pages of legal language, but buried in Section 12 was the enforcement procedure. Any fine over $100 had to be approved by a majority of the HOA board, not just the president acting alone. Furthermore, homeowners had the right to present evidence at a hearing, and the board was required to consider all relevant facts before making a final determination. I also found something interesting in Section 4.7, the nuisance animal clause Brenda had cited. It defined excessive barking as continuous noise for periods exceeding 30 minutes that is audible from neighboring properties and occurs with regularity. Max didn't come close to meeting that standard. Armed with this information, I started preparing for the hearing. I made copies of the animal control report, compiled my video evidence, created a log of Max's barking incidents with timestamps, and even got written statements from Tom Patterson and my neighbor on the right, elderly Mrs. Gloria Henderson, both testifying that they'd never been disturbed by Max. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community center, which was basically a glorified meeting room with desert landscape paintings and uncomfortable plastic chairs. When I arrived, I found Brenda already seated at a folding table at the front of the room, along with two other board members I recognized. Keith Wagner, a quiet accountant who lived on the other side of the development, and Patricia Lennox, a retired teacher who seemed perpetually exhausted by Brenda's drama. There were also about a dozen other residents scattered around the room, apparently there to watch the proceedings. I recognized a few faces, including Tom, who gave me an encouraging nod. Brenda called the meeting to order with officious gravity. We're here tonight to address the complaint against Ryan Foster of 4782 Desert Willow Court regarding excessive dog barking and failure to maintain a peaceful environment in accordance with HOA covenants. I raised my hand. Before we begin, I'd like to clarify the procedure. According to Section 12 of the HOA covenant, I have the right to present evidence and testimony. Is that correct? Patricia looked surprised but nodded. Yes, that's correct. Brenda's jaw tightened. Of course, but let me first present the HOA's case. I have documented over 20 instances in the past month where barking from Mr. Foster's property has exceeded acceptable levels. She pulled out her iPad and began reading dates and times, painting a picture of Max as a non-stop barking machine. When she finished, I calmly stood up. May I present my evidence now? Keith gestured for me to proceed. I set up my laptop and connected it to the projector in the room, which took a minute and made Brenda drum her fingers impatiently on the table. First, I'd like to submit the report from Maricopa County Animal Control, dated 3 days ago. I handed copies to each board member. Officer Linda Chavez conducted a site visit and determined that my dog, Max, does not exhibit excessive barking behavior. Her report specifically states that the complaint was unsubstantiated. I could see Patricia reading the report with interest. Keith was taking notes. Second, I've installed security cameras with audio recording covering my property. I have footage from the dates and times Brenda mentioned. I played several clips, each showing Max either not barking at all or barking once or twice briefly. As you can see, Max is not the source of prolonged barking. However, I continued, there is excessive barking audible in the recordings. It's coming from a different location. I played the clip with the clearest audio of the distant yapping. I believe this barking is actually coming from dogs at Brenda's property, which is diagonal from mine. The room went completely silent. All eyes turned to Brenda, whose face had gone from pink to crimson. That's ridiculous, she sputtered. I don't even have a dog. Then where is that barking coming from? I asked. It's clearly audible, it matches the times you documented, and it's definitely not Max. Tom spoke up from the audience. I can confirm that I've heard barking coming from the Morrison property. Multiple small dogs, sounds like. Another voice chimed in, a woman I didn't know well. I've heard it too. I walk my daughter to the school bus stop every morning and I hear yapping from that direction around 6:30. Brenda stood up abruptly. This is absurd. Even if there is occasional barking in the neighborhood, which is normal and expected, that doesn't excuse Mr. Foster's dog from contributing to the noise. But the animal control officer found that he wasn't contributing to any nuisance noise, Patricia said quietly. That's their professional assessment. We are the HOA. We set standards higher than the county minimum, Brenda shot back. We can't fine someone for something that isn't happening, Keith said, speaking for the first time. He looked at me. Do you have anything else to present? I handed over the written statements from my neighbors and my personal log of Max's barking. I've documented every instance of barking from Max over the past 2 weeks. As you'll see, it's minimal and brief, well within any reasonable standard. The board members reviewed everything while the audience whispered among themselves. Finally, Keith looked up. I move that we dismiss the fine against Mr. Foster and close this complaint. There's no evidence supporting the claim of excessive barking. Second, Patricia said immediately. Brenda's eyes flashed with anger. As president, I have the authority to override this decision if I believe it's not in the best interest of the community. Keith shook his head. Actually, according to our bylaws, a 2/3 majority of the board can override the president. You're outvoted, Brenda. I could see Brenda calculating whether to push further, but with the audience watching and 2 board members clearly against her, she had no choice. Fine. The fine is dismissed, but I'll be monitoring this situation closely. Perhaps, Patricia said carefully, we should all be monitoring the actual source of the barking. If it's disturbing residents, we need to address it properly. The meeting adjourned shortly after, and several people came up to me to offer congratulations or commiseration about having to deal with HOA nonsense. Tom clapped me on the shoulder. Good job, man. You documented everything, stayed calm, followed the rules. That's how you beat these things. But as I packed up my laptop, I saw Brenda watching me from across the room, and the look in her eyes told me this war wasn't over, just this particular battle. I was right, but the next attack came from an angle I didn't expect. 3 weeks passed relatively peacefully. Max and I went about our normal routine. I went to work, came home, took Max for evening walks around the neighborhood, played fetch in the backyard on weekends. The distant yapping continued every morning like clockwork, but I stopped worrying about it since I'd been officially cleared. Then I came home one Tuesday to find my front yard dug up. Not by an animal or some random vandalism, but officially, with orange spray paint marks, and a sign stating that utility work was being conducted. Except there was no utility truck, no workers, just holes in my carefully maintained desert landscaping and my drip irrigation system completely destroyed. I immediately called the city utilities office. I have unmarked holes in my yard and no explanation. Can you tell me if there's work being done at my address? The person on the other end checked their records. No, sir. We don't have any scheduled work in your area. If someone's digging on your property, they should have called 811 for marking at least 2 days in advance. Do you know who did the digging? No, that's what I'm trying to figure out. You might want to call the non-emergency police line to report it. Unauthorized excavation can be dangerous if they hit gas or electric lines. I hung up and stared at my ruined yard. The holes were actually near where utility lines probably would run, which suggested someone knew what they were doing, or at least wanted it to look official. But who would do this? My phone rang. It was the HOA management company, not Brenda directly, but a woman named Stephanie who handled administrative tasks. Mr. Foster, I'm calling to inform you that you're being cited for failure to maintain your landscaping. The front yard of your property is not in compliance with HOA standards. Are you kidding me? Someone dug up my yard without permission. I just came home and found it like this. There was a pause. I'm just conveying the message, Mr. Foster. You have 7 days to restore the landscaping or face a fine of $200. Who authorized digging up my yard? I don't have that information. I'm sorry. After she hung up, I stood in my destroyed front yard, absolutely certain now that this was Brenda's doing. But how could I prove it? I checked my front yard security camera footage. I'd been at work from 7 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. I scrolled through the footage and found what I was looking for. At 11:45, a white pickup truck pulled up. Two men in work clothes got out, walked around my front yard for a few minutes looking at the ground and talking, then proceeded to dig several holes with shovels and a small excavator they unloaded from the truck. They worked for about 90 minutes, then packed up and left. The license plate was partially visible in one frame. I zoomed in and managed to make out most of it. I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. The dispatcher said an officer would come by to take a report. Officer Michael Dunn arrived about an hour later. He was a young cop, probably mid-20s, who listened to my story with increasing interest. I showed him the camera footage, and he wrote down the license plate number. "This is definitely trespassing and property damage," he said. "Probably criminal damage to property. I'll run this plate and see what comes up. You said you think your HOA president might be involved. I can't prove it, but I've been having issues with her. She filed a false complaint about my dog, and now this happens right after I won that dispute. You have any estimate on damages?" I looked at my torn-up irrigation system and the displaced desert plants. Probably at least $1,000 to fix, maybe more. Officer Dunn took photos and said he'd be in touch. After he left, I called a landscaping company to get an actual estimate. They came out the next morning and quoted me $1,200 to repair everything. I submitted the estimate to the HOA, along with the police report number, and demanded they cover the cost, since the damage happened due to someone claiming to do HOA-related work. The response from the HOA management company was that they had no record of authorizing any work on my property and therefore weren't liable. I was furious, but also calculating my next move. If Brenda had hired those guys, there would be a money trail. If she'd done it through the HOA budget, that was embezzlement. If she'd paid them personally, that was fraud and criminal damage. Either way, she was exposed. Officer Dunn called me 3 days later. "Mr. Foster, I looked into that license plate. The truck is registered to Desert Landscaping Solutions, a company based in Mesa. I called them, and they said they were hired for that job through a website where people can post work requests. The person who posted the job listed your address and said it was for utility access inspection prior to HOA-approved landscaping renovation. Do they have a name for who hired them? They have a name and payment information. The job was posted by a Brenda Morrison, paid for through a credit card in her name. My heart started pounding. So she hired them to dig up my yard and then tried to fine me for the damage. That's what it looks like. I've documented all of this. You can press charges if you want. This would likely be criminal damage, which is a Class 6 felony in Arizona if the damage is over $1,000, or a Class 1 misdemeanor if it's under. Given your estimate, we're probably looking at felony territory. What would happen if I press charges? I'd submit the case to the county attorney's office. They'd review it and decide whether to prosecute. Given that we have clear documentation, payment records, and the damage amount, there's a good chance they'd pursue it. I thought about Brenda, her perfect highlights and her righteous indignation, potentially facing criminal charges. Part of me felt bad, but a larger part of me remembered her trying to force me to get rid of Max, her false complaints, her abuse of HOA power. "I want to press charges," I said. "All right. I'll put together the case file and submit it. You'll probably be contacted by the county attorney's office within a few weeks." That evening, I sent a detailed email to Keith Wagner and Patricia Lennox, the other board members, explaining what had happened and attaching the police report. I also sent a copy to the HOA management company. The response was swift. The next day, I received a call from Keith. Ryan, this is extremely serious. If Brenda really did this, she needs to step down from the board immediately. Patricia and I are calling an emergency board meeting. Would you be willing to present your evidence? Absolutely. The emergency meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning. When I arrived at the community center, I found a much larger crowd than before. Word had spread through the neighborhood about what happened, and people were angry. It turned out I wasn't the only person Brenda had targeted. A man named Carlos Ramirez stood up during the open comment period. Brenda fined me $300 last year for having a truck parked in my driveway. Said it violated the vehicle restrictions in the covenant. But when I checked, the rule only applied to commercial vehicles, and my truck is personal. When I tried to appeal, she refused to hear it and sent the fine to collections. A woman named Susan Park raised her hand. She threatened to fine me for having a playground set in my backyard, said it was an unapproved structure. I had to hire a lawyer to prove that swing sets are specifically allowed in the covenant. Story after story emerged, a pattern of Brenda using her position to harass residents, collect fines, and wield power. Some of it was petty, some of it crossed into potential legal territory. When it was my turn, I presented all my evidence. The camera footage of the landscaping crew, the police report, the payment records Officer Dunn had uncovered linking Brenda to the job. The room was dead silent as I explained how she tried to fine me for the damage she herself had caused. Patricia looked devastated. I had no idea it was this bad. Brenda, do you have anything to say? Brenda had been sitting in the corner, arms crossed, face stony. This is a witch hunt. You're all ganging up on me because I have the courage to enforce the rules that keep this community desirable. Yes, I hired that landscaping company, but it was because I believed there was a legitimate need to inspect utility access on Mr. Foster's property. There's been talk about upgrading the development's water lines. There's been no such talk, Keith said flatly. And even if there was, you don't have the authority to authorize excavation on someone's private property without their permission. That's illegal, Brenda. I was acting in the HOA's best interest. You were acting in your own interest, Patricia said, and there was steel in her voice now. You've been abusing your position, and it needs to stop. I move that we immediately suspend Brenda Morrison from her role as HOA president pending a full investigation. Second, Keith said. Brenda stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You can't do this. I've dedicated years to this community. I've kept property values up, maintained standards, dealt with problem homeowners who want to turn this place into a slum. You've harassed people, filed false reports, and apparently committed fraud, I said, my voice calm but firm. This isn't about enforcing rules. This is about you targeting anyone who doesn't do exactly what you want. The vote was unanimous among the remaining board members. Brenda was suspended immediately, and Keith would serve as interim president. Furthermore, the board voted to hire an independent auditor to review all HOA finances and enforcement actions from the past 3 years to determine if there were any other irregularities. Brenda stormed out, but not before turning to me one last time. This isn't over, Ryan Foster. You're going to regret this. But it was over for Brenda, at least as far as the HOA was concerned. The county attorney's office contacted me 2 weeks later. A prosecutor named Jennifer Callahan explained that they were moving forward with charges against Brenda Morrison for criminal damage to property and fraud. The amount of the damage, combined with the fraudulent misrepresentation and the clear intent to cause harm, qualified it as a Class 6 felony. Cases like this are unusual, Jennifer told me over the phone. Usually, HOA disputes stay in civil court, But when someone crosses the line into actual criminal conduct, we take it seriously. She'll probably be offered a plea deal, but I wanted you to know that we're pursuing it. The audit of the HOA finances revealed more problems. Over the past 3 years, Brenda had collected over $15,000 in fines, many of which appeared to be questionable or completely unjustified. She'd also approved payments to various contractors for work that was either never done or wildly overpriced. Some of that money had made its way back to her through a complicated arrangement where she received consulting fees for project management. It was embezzlement, plain and simple. The HOA hired a lawyer and filed a civil suit against Brenda to recover the stolen funds. The criminal case moved forward in parallel. Brenda hired an expensive defense attorney who tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, that she'd been trying to maintain community standards and had made some accounting errors but nothing criminal. Nobody was buying it. I followed the case as it progressed through the legal system. Brenda was formally indicted on 3 counts: criminal damage to property, fraud, and theft for the embezzlement. Her attorney negotiated with the prosecutor's office, and ultimately, Brenda accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to 1 count of fraud and 1 count of theft, both reduced to misdemeanors, in exchange for the criminal damage charge being dropped. She was sentenced to 2 years of supervised probation, 300 hours of community service, and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and to me, personally, for my damaged landscaping. She also had to resign from the HOA board permanently and was barred from serving in any HOA leadership position. The total restitution came to over $20,000. Her husband, who I'd barely ever seen, filed for divorce about a month after she was sentenced. Apparently, he'd had no idea about any of her HOA activities or the embezzlement, and he wasn't willing to stick around for the aftermath. For me, life slowly returned to normal. The HOA, now under Keith's reasonable leadership, operated much more smoothly. Fines were only issued for legitimate, clear violations, and only after warnings. The board started approving reasonable requests for modifications and improvements that had previously been arbitrarily denied. Property values actually went up, contrary to Brenda's dire predictions, because people wanted to live in a community with a functional HOA rather than a dysfunctional dictatorship. Max continued being Max, occasionally barking at the mailman, spending his days lounging in the yard, completely oblivious to the legal drama he'd indirectly triggered. The mysterious morning yapping continued for a few more weeks, then stopped abruptly. I later learned through the neighborhood gossip network that Brenda had been breeding small dogs in her home as a side business, which was itself a violation of the HOA covenant that prohibited home-based businesses that created traffic or noise. When she was forced to move out of Desert Heights after the divorce settlement, the dogs went with her, so in the end, Brenda had been complaining about noise from her own dogs but attributing it to Max, because she couldn't admit that she was the one violating the rules. The irony was almost too perfect. One evening, about 6 months after everything had been resolved, Tom Patterson came over with a 6-pack of beer. We sat in my backyard, Max sprawled at our feet, watching the sun set over the desert. "You know what's crazy?" Tom said. "This all started because she claimed your dog barked too much," I laughed. "Yeah, and now she's got a criminal record and lost her house, all because she couldn't just leave well enough alone. I heard she moved to some apartment in Temp, working at a grocery store. I almost feel bad for her." "Don't. She did this to herself. You just defended yourself and your dog. Everything else was her own choices." We sat in comfortable silence for a while. Max rolled over in his sleep, chasing something in his dreams, his legs twitching. "Good boy," I murmured. Tom raised his beer. "To good dogs and bad HOA presidents getting what they deserve." I clinked my bottle against his. "I'll drink to that." The following weeks brought an unexpected development that added another layer to the already complicated situation. I received a letter from a law firm representing several of my neighbors who had been fined or harassed by Brenda during her tenure as HOA president. They were forming a class action lawsuit and wanted to know if I'd be willing to serve as one of the lead plaintiffs. The attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Winters, met with me at a coffee shop in downtown Scottsdale to explain the case. "What Brenda Morrison did goes beyond just your situation, Ryan. We've identified at least 37 homeowners who were subjected to improper fines, harassment, or had their legitimate appeals ignored. The HOA itself bears some responsibility for allowing this to continue for so long. The HOA already fired her and recovered the embezzled money," I pointed out. "True, but many homeowners paid fines they shouldn't have paid. They were bullied into compliance. Some people sold their homes and moved out of Desert Heights specifically because of Brenda's harassment. That's damages. Real, quantifiable damages." I thought about Carlos Ramirez, who'd paid $300 for a fine that was completely unjustified. About Susan Park, who'd had to hire her own lawyer. About elderly Mrs. Chen, who'd lived in fear of violating some obscure rule and being fined. "What would this lawsuit accomplish?" Rebecca leaned forward. "Financial compensation for those who were wronged. But more importantly, it would force HOAs to implement better oversight mechanisms. Right now, the law gives HOA boards broad authority, but there's very little accountability. Cases like yours could set precedent for how HOAs can be held liable when board members abuse their power." "Would this be against Brenda personally, or the HOA?" "Both. Brenda for her actions, and the HOA for negligent supervision and failure to provide adequate checks and balances. The HOA has insurance that would cover most of a settlement or judgment. Brenda's already proven she doesn't have significant assets, but her personal liability would still be important for the precedent." I agreed to join the lawsuit, and over the next several months, the case developed. More homeowners came forward with their stories. The attorney took depositions from current and former board members. Documents were subpoenaed. The HOA's insurance company pushed hard for settlement, not wanting to risk a large judgment. During this process, I learned more about how Brenda had operated. She'd kept 2 sets of books, one official and one personal, where she tracked which homeowners she considered compliant and which were problems. I was in the problem category, along with anyone who'd ever questioned her authority or tried to appeal a fine. She'd also been in communication with other HOA board members in nearby developments, sharing strategies for maintaining control and dealing with difficult residents. Some of these communications bordered on conspiracy to violate homeowner rights. The legal proceedings dragged on, as they always do, but eventually, the HOA's insurance company offered a settlement. $250,000 to be divided among the affected homeowners, plus an agreement that the Desert Heights HOA would implement new governance procedures, including term limits for board members, mandatory annual audits, and an independent appeals process for any fine over $100. Each homeowner who'd been improperly fined would receive full reimbursement, plus damages calculated based on the severity of the harassment they'd endured. My portion came to about $8,000, covering my legal fees, the landscaping damage, and compensation for the stress and time I'd spent fighting Brenda's false complaints. But the money wasn't really the point. The policy changes were what mattered. Desert Heights would have real accountability now, and other HOAs in Arizona were paying attention to the case. Through all of this, Max remained blissfully unaware that he'd become a symbol of standing up to petty tyranny. He did, however, enjoy all the treats that neighbors started bringing by. Apparently, he'd become something of a neighborhood celebrity, the dog who brought down the HOA president. One Saturday afternoon, I was working in my newly restored front yard when a car pulled up and a woman stepped out. She was in her 60s, well-dressed, with an air of authority. "Ryan Foster," she asked. "That's me. I'm Deanne Mercer. I'm a state representative in the Arizona legislature. I've been following your case with interest." I stood up, wiping dirt from my hands. "Oh, I'm working on legislation to reform HOA governance in Arizona. Your case, and others like it, have highlighted serious gaps in oversight and accountability. I wanted to talk to you about potentially testifying before the legislature about your experience." We ended up talking for over an hour. Deanne explained that Arizona HOAs governed over 1 million residents, but operated with minimal state oversight. Board members had broad powers but little training. Homeowners had few practical options for appealing unfair treatment short of expensive lawsuits. "What we're proposing," Deanne said, "is a state-level HOA ombudsman office. Homeowners could file complaints about improper fines or harassment, and there would be an official investigation. Serious violations could result in state sanctions against the HOA, including removal of board members and appointment of a state supervisor." That sounds like it would have helped my situation. Exactly. We're also proposing mandatory training for all HOA board members, stricter financial auditing requirements, and simplified procedures for homeowners to access HOA records. Your story illustrates why these protections are necessary. I agreed to testify, and several months later, I found myself in the Arizona State Capitol building in Phoenix, sitting before the House Committee on Local and International Affairs. I told my story, showed the committee my evidence, and explained how Brenda had abused her position and how difficult it had been to fight back. Other homeowners from across Arizona testified too, sharing similar stories of HOA overreach and abuse. Some were worse than mine. People who'd lost their homes through dubious foreclosure actions, families torn apart by harassment, elderly residents driven to financial ruin by endless fines. The committee listened intently. Several legislators asked sharp questions about current HOA governance structures and what safeguards had failed. By the end of the day, I felt cautiously optimistic that something meaningful might come from all this. The legislation, eventually designated as House Bill 2847, passed the committee and moved to the full House. It faced opposition from HOA management companies and some real estate groups who argued it would be burdensome and expensive to implement. But homeowner advocacy groups rallied support, and the bill passed the House with a strong majority. The Senate version took longer and required compromises, but by the end of the legislative session, a modified version of the bill passed both chambers. Governor Katie Hobbs signed it into law that July, and it would take effect the following January. Arizona now had comprehensive HOA reform, and I'd played a small part in making it happen. Back in Desert Heights, life continued its steady rhythm. Keith Wagner proved to be an excellent HOA president, focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement. He organized neighborhood events, oversaw some genuinely needed infrastructure repairs, and treated homeowners with respect. The new appeals process got its first test when a homeowner 3 streets over was cited for having weeds in his yard. He filed an appeal, explaining that he'd been in the hospital for surgery and hadn't been able to maintain the landscaping. The board, reviewing the appeal, waived the fine and even arranged for volunteers to help with the yard work. It was such a stark contrast to how Brenda would have handled it. As for Brenda herself, I heard occasional updates through the neighborhood grapevine. She'd completed her community service and was living quietly in Temp, working a regular job, keeping her head down. Her ex-husband had remarried. Her kids, both in their 20s, reportedly had minimal contact with her. Part of me wondered if she understood what she'd done wrong, if she'd gained any self-awareness through the whole ordeal. But mostly, I tried not to think about her at all. One evening, almost a year after the original animal control complaint, I was sitting on my back patio with Max when my phone rang. It was Officer Linda Chavez from Animal Control. "Mr. Foster, I hope I'm not bothering you. I just wanted to follow up on your case." "Oh, hi, Officer Chavez. Everything's been fine here. Max is still his same calm self," she laughed. "I figured as much. Actually, I'm calling because your case has become something we use in training now. When we train new animal control officers, we show them the documentation you provided and explain how a thorough investigation revealed that the complaint was false and actually stemmed from the complainant's own animals. It's a good lesson in not taking complaints at face value and doing proper investigation. I'm glad something positive came from it, more than you know. We've had 3 similar cases in the past year where HOA board members filed false complaints against residents they had personal disputes with. Because of your case, we knew what to look for. We've been able to shut down that kind of harassment before it escalated." After we hung up, I sat there feeling a strange sense of closure. What had started as a petty, annoying complaint about my dog had turned into a much larger story about accountability, justice, and systemic reform. I hadn't set out to be an activist or a test case. I just wanted to defend Max and be left alone. But sometimes standing up for yourself, documenting everything, and refusing to be bullied can ripple outward in unexpected ways. Max stretched and yawned, then padded over to rest his head on my knee. I scratched behind his ears, and he made that contented groaning sound. "You know you're kind of famous now, right, buddy?" I said. He just looked at me with those soulful brown eyes, tail wagging slowly. "The dog who changed HOA law in Arizona." He responded by licking my hand and then wandering off to investigate a lizard that was scurrying along the fence. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds rather than distant yapping. The neighborhood was peaceful. I made coffee, let Max out into the backyard, and checked my email while the sun rose over the desert. There was a message from Keith Wagner with the subject line, "Community Appreciation Event." He was organizing a neighborhood barbecue in 2 weeks, and he wanted to make sure I could attend. "It would mean a lot to have you there, Ryan. You've done more for this community than you probably realize." I smiled and typed back that I'd be there. Later that day, I ran into Mrs. Chen while checking my mailbox. She was carrying a small package and moving slowly, as she always did. "Ryan, dear," she said, her face lighting up. "How is Max?" "He's great, Mrs. Chen. How are you?" "Oh, much better now, so much less stressful these days. I actually enjoy living here again." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Before, I was always worried. Every day, thinking what rule I might be breaking, what fine I might receive. Now I just enjoy my roses and my garden. It's what retirement should be." That simple statement hit me harder than all the legal victories and legislative testimony. This was what it was really about. Ordinary people being able to live in their homes without fear of arbitrary harassment. "I'm glad, Mrs. Chen. You enjoy those roses." She smiled and shuffled off toward her house, and I stood there in the warm Arizona sun, thinking about how strange life could be. The neighborhood barbecue turned out to be a bigger deal than I expected. Keith had gone all out, renting a huge grill, getting permits to use the community center's large outdoor space, and organizing games for kids. There must have been over 100 people there, maybe half the development. I brought Max, figuring he'd earned his place at the celebration. He immediately became the center of attention, especially with the kids, who'd heard all about the famous dog and wanted to pet him and take pictures with him. Tom Patterson showed up with his family, and we manned the grill together, flipping burgers and hot dogs while catching up on life. His wife, Sarah, thanked me for standing up to Brenda. Tom was miserable before, she said. He'd come home stressed about what new ridiculous rule Brenda had invented. Now he actually enjoys living here again. Carlos Ramirez brought his whole extended family, and we had a good laugh about the truck situation. "I've got that truck parked right in my driveway every single day now," he said proudly. "And nobody says a word because it's not actually against any rules." Susan Park introduced me to her kids, who were playing happily on the playground set that had caused so much drama. "They love it," she said. "And I love that I don't have to worry about it anymore." As the sun began to set and the party was winding down, Keith called for everyone's attention. He gave a short speech about community, about how Desert Heights had gone through a difficult period but had emerged stronger and more united. "I want to especially recognize Ryan Foster," Keith said, and I felt my face flush as everyone turned to look at me. Ryan could have just paid the fines, gotten rid of his dog, and moved away. But he stood his ground, documented everything, and fought back against injustice. Because of his courage, we've all benefited. Our HOA is better, our state laws are better, and our community is better. People applauded and several shouted supportive comments. Max, hearing the commotion, barked once, which made everyone laugh. "Even Max agrees," someone called out. After Keith's speech, people came up to thank me, shake my hand, or share their own stories. It was overwhelming but also deeply gratifying. I'd never thought of myself as particularly brave or special. I just refused to accept an unjust situation. As the crowd dispersed and families headed home, I helped Keith clean up. We were breaking down tables when he said, "You know, we'll need to hold board elections in a few months. Patricia's term is ending. Have you ever considered joining the board?" I laughed. "I don't know, Keith. After everything I went through, serving on an HOA board is kind of the last thing I'd want to do." "I get it. But that's exactly why you'd be good at it. You understand what it's like to be on the receiving end of HOA overreach. You'd make sure we stay accountable." I told him I'd think about it, but honestly, I wasn't sure. Part of me wanted to just enjoy my life without any more HOA drama, but another part of me recognized that systems only work when good people participate in them. If everyone who'd been burned by bad governance refused to get involved, then the Brendas of the world would always end up in charge. "Let me think about it," I said finally. That night, I sat on my back patio with Max, looking up at the stars. The desert night was cool and quiet. No distant yapping, no drama, no false complaints. Just peace. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Callahan, the prosecutor. "Wanted to let you know that Brenda Morrison completed her restitution payments today. Your portion will be direct deposited tomorrow. Case officially closed." I typed back a thank you and set the phone down. Case officially closed. Those words felt significant, like the end of a long chapter. Max wandered over and flopped down at my feet with a heavy sigh. I reached down to pet him, and he rolled over for belly rubs, his tail thumping against the concrete. "You know what, Max? I think we're going to be just fine." He responded by closing his eyes in contentment, completely trusting and at peace. And in that moment, sitting under the Arizona stars with my dog beside me and genuine peace in my community for the first time in years, I realized that all the stress, all the documentation, all the legal battles had been worth it, not just for me, but for everyone who'd been afraid to stand up. For everyone who'd been bullied by someone abusing a small amount of power. For everyone who'd thought they had no choice but to accept injustice. Sometimes you have to fight. Sometimes you have to document everything, follow every procedure, and refuse to back down even when it would be easier to give up. And sometimes, when you do that, you don't just solve your own problem. You make things better for everyone. Max started snoring softly, and I smiled. Tomorrow I'd go back to my normal life. I'd go to work, come home, take Max for walks, enjoy my restored landscaping. I'd probably go to the next HOA meeting just to stay informed. And maybe, just maybe, I'd consider Keith's suggestion about joining the board. But tonight, I was just going to sit here with my dog and appreciate the peace we'd fought so hard to achieve. The stars wheeled overhead, constant and ancient, indifferent to human drama. But down here in Desert Heights, Arizona, in this small corner of the world, things had changed for the better. And it had all started with a false complaint about a dog who barely ever barked.